Now, Ibrahim, if I held up a graphic like this, is it, okay?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, guys, why don't we get started? So, my name is Steve Sklar. Welcome. Tonight we're going to be talking about George's critique of the Malthusian theory. This is book 2 in your Progress and Poverty. The title of which is Population and Subsistence. So first, let me just remind you or tell you, if you didn't already know, what Thomas Malthus's theory was. Thomas Malthus, an English clergyman, wrote an essay on population in 1798. In it, he posited that by nature, human population grows geometrically, doubling every 25 years, while our ability to produce subsistence, basically food, from nature grows only arithmetically, that is, at a limited and constant and necessarily slower rate. In other words, according to Malthus, population naturally has a tendency to press upon subsistence. And because of this, Malthus said, if population grows unchecked at a natural rate, that fact has to produce what he calls vice and misery, essentially crime, poverty, famine. And for that reason, Malthus advised us to either check population growth voluntarily, what he called the preventive check, or else nature will cause people to suffer and die, what he called the positive check. Again, his theory is that population naturally presses on subsistence. So today we'll look at the ways in which George showed Malthus's theory to be erroneous. But first, let's consider why the subject might matter. One reason has to do with what could be called its bearing on two fundamental and opposing views of how we ought to live in society. Consider the following. Some years ago, I took a course in law school on moral responsibility for lawyers. The teacher, Daniel Cocolette, told us that one day he was sitting in his car in a long line of traffic in Boston when another car zoomed alongside the line and cut in a ways ahead of him. Cocolette, who for what it's worth was raised as a Quaker, got out of his car and walked over to the line cutter and said, "You know, you can only do that because the rest of us are patiently waiting our turn." So this evening, as we consider George's critique of the Malthusian theory, I'd like to start by considering two views of what might be called ways of living in society. One could be called the dog-eat-dog view, and the other the cooperative view. Given the global rise of the strongman and of a kind of tribalism, these days I'm particularly interested in comparing these views. From the dog-eat-dog view, life in society is essentially combative and opportunity is inherently limited. The world is winners and losers. The thing to do is to be a winner at all costs, and if that hurts other people, so be it. Wolves and apes have their alphas, and so do we. Be an alpha. That's that view. The cooperative view is nicely described by the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who said, people are made for cooperation, like the eyelids, like the upper and lower rows of teeth. So why the Malthusian theory matters? One thing is that it has some bearing on these different rival worldviews. And it, in a sense, justifies the dog-eat-dog view. And it also lets people and their social arrangements off the hook if the cause of poverty is nature. Another reason it matters is that it persists and it's kind of ubiquitous. If you've ever either heard people say or thought to yourself something along the lines of, they're taking our jobs, or on a milder level, you've ever said, like roommates of mine in college who were pre-med, there was only so many places in med school. And if you are attracted, or you know people who are attracted to protectionism in the free trade area on the theory that there's only so much to go around and we have to get as much as we can, and the view is that that may come at the expense of others, but so be it, then you see, the shadow of, or more of this theory. Essentially, if Malthus is right, it is possible and almost inevitable to look at people as being the enemy of economic prosperity. And as a quick aside, I will say that that does not need, at least in theory, if that's how you look at things, to end with restricting immigration. I think of a case that I handled years ago. I'm an immigration lawyer by day, where I learned that in Latvia, somewhat recent law has created kind of disenfranchised people from full rights of citizenship if they don't have enough generations going back of being born in Latvia. If you're like a second or possibly third generation Latvian, you may not be considered a full citizen. So, there's really, the Malthusian theory can certainly open the door to that view that people are kind of the enemy. As George points out, the theory also serves vested interests because it lets them off the hook, as I said. If nature is at fault, then human arrangements of the type that George has been talking about and you've already been studying is off the hook. So from George's perspective, his central insight, which essentially is that as society grows in population and advances in its ability to produce wealth, land grows in value and people have to pay more for the privilege of using it. George, that being his central insight, he kind of logically has to focus his attention, which he does right away in his seminal work, Progress and Poverty, on both the Malthusian theory and the theory that you talked about in the last session, which is the wages fund theory. Because these two theories kind of buttress each other and were the conventional wisdom, to some extent still are, at least the vestiges of them, that were the rival theories of explaining why poverty persists in developed society. So it makes sense that he would focus on that. Just as a reminder, the wages fund theory was that wages for laborers are paid out of a pre-existing and relatively fixed fund of capital set aside for that purpose. But again, in the previous session, you will have gone through how George kind of debunks that theory. So talking again about the Malthusian theory, there are two basic kinds of arguments in Book 2 of Progress and Poverty that Henry George arrays against the theory. The first type of argument is what he calls the negative argument. It basically focuses on the bases that Malthus and his supporters look to support the theory, and he basically shows that these bases, one by one, are invalid. So one thing he talks about fairly early on is the claim that population naturally grows geometrically, doubling every 25 years. He has a couple of ways of showing that this appears to have been based on a very simple mathematical fallacy. Basically, I don't know if I should do a drawing. I'm not going to attempt it. I'll just describe it. You picture in the first generation, you have 4 people, 2 men and 2 women, so population of 4. And if you assume that generations take about 25 years, which is probably what Malthus did, to produce another generation of children, then you assume that each couple has 4 children, which is not that unreasonable if you're talking about a relatively poorer class or a new population or a frontier where families tend to have a lot of kids. That's how you would arrive at the fact that those 4 people that you were starting with, you would end up with 4 per couple, so 8 in the second generation 25 years later. And if you continue that trend, it would double every 25 years, so 4, 8, 16, 32. A curve that is geometric and kind of goes like that, or I guess for you, like that. On the other hand, George points out that this is fallacious in a number of ways. First of all, it's not a given that every couple will reproduce and produce that many children. He has a rather nice quote that I'll read to you, just to get it in his words. bear with me. He says, how many children a man may have is problematical, by which he means variable and open to question. But that he had two parents is certain, and that these again had two parents each is also certain. If you follow the geometrical progression, not down in the way I was just describing, but upward, you'll also create a huge expansion going upward. In fact, as George rightly points out, the way to reason from reproduction is essentially the population is a lattice, and it may grow, but it is not a given that it will grow at the rate that Malthus assumed, because he based his assumption on a kind of a fallacy of making certain assumptions and also regarding growth only going downward. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. So the next thing he talks about is that big basis that Malthus looks at is that in certain societies, in Malthus's day and even in George's day and to some extent in our day, where population is extremely dense and there are great populations, there could be found great poverty. India, China, and Ireland are the examples that George talks about, and I know that Malthus talks at least about China in his essay. And what George has to say is that the reasons that Malthus assigns for poverty existing in those highly populated countries, namely population, are not in fact the true story. The true story, according to George, is the system of land ownership, particularly monopoly in general and land ownership monopoly in specific, historically created a kind of rapacious landlordism that basically robbed the general population of wealth that the population, in fact, was easily able to produce. And I think he goes through the history of India, talks about how the Rajas, the Maharajas, were sort of ruthless in extracting rent and tribute from lower classes, and that this only became worse and more rapacious when the English came in with colonialism. But I think, for my money, an even more compelling example that George talks about is the Irish potato famine, where he points out that it could not, in fact, have been Ireland's inability to produce wealth, as Malthus would have suggested, that was responsible for the poverty, the great poverty in the potato famine, if only from the fact that Ireland was actually actively exporting high-quality food of all kinds during the depths of the potato famine as a kind of tribute to what were, in a sense, absentee landlords, the English absentee landlords. So he calls in question, by reference to historical fact, the claim that poverty in India and China and Ireland was due to population. He sees these other causes. The next argument he brings up is he questions the use that Malthus makes of analogies to other forms of life. George is sort of interesting. He has an active, I think, interest in and flair for science, like a number of prominent thinkers of his day. He was largely self-educated but widely read, and whenever he talks about science, I find his writing has a kind of resonance to it and a clear-headedness. And he grants that in other forms of life, such as the multiplication of bacteria, animal life, and so on, that if he's willing to buy the claim that if left unchecked, growth of these various populations would crowd against the ability of nature to support them. But he says that humans are significantly different from these other forms of life, and he looks quite sensibly at two aspects of human beings. One is reason, and the other he talks about is that man, as he puts it, is the only unsatisfied animal. I'll read you a couple of quotes there because they're kind of punchy, and why should I put it one way when George can put it better? On the one hand, George says that here is the difference between the animal and the man. Both the jayhawk and the man eat chickens, but the more jayhawks, the fewer chickens, while the more men, the more chickens. And his point being that human beings make use of nature and can kind of shepherd things through agriculture and the breeding of animals and so on in a way that other forms of life cannot do. But I think his description of the sort of unsatisfied nature of people, although it's relevant to this point, I want to read it because it also has a kind of poetic resonance, which, why not? Let's take a look. He says, other animals can only make of additional supplies or additional opportunities. The only use they make of them is to multiply. But not so, he says, with man. No sooner are his, again, the male pronoun, just stand in, you think of any gender affiliation, that this is the way people wrote back in that day. No sooner are his animal wants satisfied than new wants arise. Food he wants first, as does the beast, shelter next, as does the beast, and these given, his reproductive instincts assert their sway, as do those of the beast. But here man and beast part company. The beast never goes further, the man has but set his feet on the first step of an infinite progression, a progression upon which the beast never enters, a progression away from and above the beast. The demand for quantity once satisfied, he seeks quality. The very desires that he has in common with the beast become extended, refined, exalted. It is not merely hunger, but taste that seeks gratification in food. In clothes, he seeks not merely comfort, but adornment. The rude shelter becomes a house. The undiscriminating sexual attraction begins to transmute itself into subtle influences, and the hard and common stock of animal life to blossom and to bloom into shapes of delicate beauty. As power to gratify his wants increases, so does aspiration grow, and I'll skip ahead, passing into higher forms of desire. That which slumbered in the plant and fitfully stirred in the beast awakes in the man. The eyes of the mind are opened, and he longs to know, and he talks about the desire to understand the workings of the universe and so on. So he questions on a fundamental and qualitative level the use of analogy to other forms of life, and for our purpose, the main point there, I think, is that we have the ability, which other forms of life do not have, to determine how we use subsistence in a productive way. And another thing he says is that the whole other area of how he critiques Malthus's theory is what he calls the positive, or it could be called the affirmative argument. Basically, it's disproving the theory by facts which attack the theory more directly, not just the underlying bases that are used by Malthus to buttress the theory. So one thing he talks about is a theory that also was espoused by John Stuart Mill, who was closer to being a contemporary of George. Their lifetimes overlapped a little bit. He says that, George says that it's important, for one thing, to consider the equivalence of other forms of wealth with subsistence. There has to be a more holistic view of wealth and what it does to help human beings survive and thrive. He uses an example of, if you picture a fishing community, and if some people divide up labor so that some people make canoes and others catch fish, the people who are making canoes are contributing to the catching of fish just as importantly as the people who go out in the canoes to catch the fish, and out from there to all forms of wealth that are exchanged with each other to produce what we know of as more developed civilization. But George makes the point that, in fact, again, looking at the facts, the wealth produced by a community is greatest where population is densest, and not just densest, but large. One thing he looks at there is, if you consider this city or any other big city or a relatively prosperous region, not necessarily a great city, you'll find forms of wealth that very quickly you'll see developing forms of wealth that are produced by the community that go quite obviously beyond the most basic subsistence, which George points at to make the point that those things are really evidence of the fact that basic production, which is limited in a more primitive community, and which people struggle to make at first because you need to eat and you need to have shelter, the fact that you can produce not just basic food but fancy food and all kinds of elaborate shelters is a sign that the community has grown in its ability to produce wealth, because if it hadn't grown, it would still be struggling to produce what has to be produced at the frontier to satisfy the most basic elements of life. And you'll find that greater production of wealth, that sign that there is a significant increase in wealth-producing power wherever societies develop progressively. So that's kind of a counter to what Malthus would have claimed, looking at the actual development of societies. I'll come back to a section I want to read about that, which I think is rather eloquent, but that's the summary for now. So I did a little quick fact research myself, and in about an hour's time, basically using Google, I was able to find some statistics on the growth of population in the last 50 years or so, the last half of the 20th century, essentially, and also figures for the same amount of time for global GDP, gross domestic product. So I'll read you the figures. I'll give you my analysis. I'll hold up a little graphic that I printed out and tell you where I got these figures. So the top curve is population from the period 1950 to roughly 2012, so roughly a 50-year period. And in that period, world population grew from a little over 2.5 billion to a little under 6.5 billion. So that's an increase of about 255%. Source of that is the U.S. Bureau of the Census International Database. So I guess if you're really motivated to look for it, you could find that probably on Google or via Google. The second curve, the part to look at is this part, which is for the same period. So both cover basically 1950 to 2003, and I looked up the underlying table of figures in order to get data for those two dates. So at the same time that population for the world globally grew from about 2.5 billion to about 6.5 billion, gross domestic product globally, which is a per capita measure in these data analyses, grew from $2,113 on the average per person in the world to $6,516. Now, let me be responsible here and tell you what their definition of GDP was. It was, first of all, there was an attempt made in that study to equate dollars across different periods of time with each other, and so they're all set in terms of what are called 1990 Geary Camus dollars, in order to sort of even out the differences in purchasing power between $1 in 1950 and $1 in later years. So the components of GDP on this lower chart are personal consumption expenditures plus business investment plus government spending plus net exports, which itself is defined as exports minus imports. And I'll come back to that in a second. So I want to make a couple of points off of this. When we look at these curves, If we take for the moment, although I'm going to question it in a moment, if we take for the moment the measure of GDP as some kind of a rough guide to the world's ability to produce wealth, and I'll come back to that, so take that with a grain of salt. But if we take it as standing for that, we see a couple of things that directly refute Malthus's claim, at least as far as these dates. And actually, I picked these dates because these are the periods of time for which we have the best figures on global GDP. The spikes here, it didn't go down to zero in between the spikes. These spikes are data points. So there are indications that going back in time, the trend was somewhat similar and certainly on the increase for global GDP. But the studies were sparse going back many years. Nevertheless, if you look at these two curves and take this one as some kind of a rough measure of the ability on the average of people to produce wealth, you see a number of levels of refutation of Malthus's theory. Because what Malthus said was that as population grows, our average ability to produce per person wealth will decline. So what you would expect to see as a measure of productivity would be something that goes downward as population goes upward. In fact, if you saw that it was just flat, that we had the same ability per person on the average to produce wealth as population has grown, that would be a refutation of Malthus. He predicted it would go down. That it would stay the same refutes his claim and John Stuart Mill's claim of diminishing returns. The second point is, and in fact, quite the opposite, it goes up, which is the absolute opposite of what Malthus said would happen. The second thing we notice is that the growth curve, at least in the last 50 years or so, the last half of the 20th century, has not doubled every 25 years. Malthus is very clear in claiming that that would happen. And this is global population. So that suggests that his claim there is false, and you don't need a lot of discussion about what population means. Now, I just want to, not to undercut myself, but I think it's worth doing here. There are a number of things to be careful about in what I've just said. One is that it's not clear to me, so I'm just going to question it, and we can discuss it later if you like, that gross domestic product, as it's been defined for the study, is the same as the production of wealth the way George defines wealth. George defines wealth as natural products, so moved, altered, combined, and so on, transformed to better fit them for the satisfaction of human desires. It seems to me where you have a component that has to do with investment, business investment is part of the GDP definition, and to some extent government spending, less so personal consumption expenditures, but there is a question whether there are investments that would include, say, land. And if there are, it's not clear to me, I mean, others may know, but to the extent that there may be, this may not be the measure of the kind of wealth that George is talking about in his works. So I don't want to dwell on this too much. I just want to point out, I guess the moral to me, the takeaway is you have to be careful when looking at studies always at the definition of terms and think, as clearly as you can about what's being said. So I'm not sure that these nice graphs that I've produced as powerfully refute Malthus as I initially claimed. So you can take everything I say with a grain of salt if you like. But there's a larger point, that a bit of a digression, but I think it's worth making, which is a word about statistics. So just as George bemoaned the introduction of abstruse jargon into the study of political economy, to sound jargony, you could call it the scholasticization of the subject, which is, getting worse there. He lamented also the trend towards an overly statistical approach to economics, to the detriment of a deeper or more qualitative analysis. Now, I just want to say, actually, In the 1970s, when my father taught the Progress and Poverty course at the George School, the saying somewhere around that school was that modern economists can calculate to several decimal places the average number of poor people in a given area. But as to why these people are poor, they have relatively little to say. At least that was the George School perspective then. I'm not sure it's changed that much. But the point I want to make here is, I was mulling this over the last day, getting ready to give this talk. I think it's actually also a little misleading to think of a statistical approach to economics and a qualitative approach, which is more what George engages in, as being a dichotomy. I don't really think that they're at odds with each other. I think the takeaway here is something milder. It is that I think, under the influence of George's thinking, and I'm an admirer of his thinking, the point to me is that statistics and statistical analysis, again, just as with my little questionable presentation of a moment ago, what I think one always has to focus on in the search for deeper insight about the causes of great economic problems, I think you always have to return to underlying and rather qualitative assumptions. And it's easy to get sort of lost in the figures and the charts and the graphs, which would be kind of losing the forest for the trees. And I think, the reason thinking over it a little bit more before giving this talk, the reason I don't think that a statistical approach to economics is necessarily a bad thing is, I think George himself showed that he was quite fascinated with, the workings of science. And there's, if you kind of read between the lines, I think he also has interest in somewhat in mathematics and so on. And I think, statistics, just as in physics, can be quite valuable in the study of economics, or as it used to be called, political economy. But I think George has a valid point, because this was happening even in his day, where a number of the very sweeping and important qualitative insights that he stumbled on and talks about are obfuscated by what he saw as an overly statistical emphasis on charts and graphs to the detriment of these underlying qualitative points. So that's my little digression on that. Another point that George makes is he concedes that it could someday happen that the earth could be overrun with people, that we would be standing shoulder to shoulder and then have no place to stand but on each other's heads. But he makes the point that that hasn't yet happened, and that because of our ability to produce wealth and the actual history of what population appears to do to our ability to produce wealth, that nothing like what Malthus talked about has ever yet actually taken place. He also says, similarly, someday the sun will exhaust itself. But that's not the kind of thing that Malthus is talking about. Another point that George makes in that area is that it pays to remember that both wealth and people are products of nature, and that wealth, from the moment it is created, begins to return to nature. He has, in various parts of his works, he has some eloquent, obviously, accurate descriptions of how different examples of wealth, for example, a house, a building, a car. I mean, he doesn't talk about a car, but any structure, any manufactured product that has to work or that we care about, that we use for various purposes, has to be maintained, because from the moment it's created, it starts to revert to the state of nature from whence it came. Or as my wife would tell me to say, whence it came, and no use of the word from. If you think of your house, or any house, a number of years go by and the exterior will start to be worn away. That has to be maintained. the plumbing systems, the electrical. This space, this lovely space that we're in right now, had to be renovated. It's probably well over 100 years old. Had it not been renovated, had the building not been maintained, it would be just a matter of time. It might be many decades, but eventually nature would reclaim it, and that's what you find in any buildings that are not maintained. And so with every form of wealth, I mean, food obviously is consumed, but if you think of what we think of as more permanent wealth, eventually everything reverts back to a state of nature. And so do we. George points out that, basically we cycle a sort of order through ourselves, but when it comes time for us to die, our elements go back to nature. So it's not as if, his point here as far as the Malthusian theory is concerned, it's not as if the things that we take from nature are removed permanently from nature. Essentially, what he's saying is that energy and matter are conserved, even though he was writing well before the modern era of physics. So I have a couple more points, and then hopefully we'll get into a discussion. So another, the final major point I want to make is that George looks at the actual effect of population growth, which we summarized before, on our ability to produce wealth in order to refute Malthus's theory. And that I'm going to read at a little bit of length because I think it's very compelling. The point that George is making here is, well, I'll let him make the point. Here he says, let us imagine, and I'm jumping ahead in the book a bit. This is book 4, chapter 2, on the increase of population. So I'm cheating a little bit, but not much, because it's really relevant to his discussion of population and subsistence. Here he says, let us imagine is an unbounded savanna, stretching off in unbroken sameness of grass and flower, tree and rill, till the traveler tires of the monotony. Along comes the wagon of the first immigrant. Where to settle he cannot tell. Every acre seems as good as every other acre. As to wood, as to water, as to fertility, as to situation, there is absolutely no choice, and he is perplexed by the embarrassment of richness. Tired out with the search for one place that is better than another, he stops, somewhere, anywhere, and starts to make himself a home. The soil is virgin and rich, game is abundant, the streams flash with the finest trout. Nature is at her very best. He has what, were he in a populous district, would make him rich, but he is very poor. To say nothing of the mental craving which would lead him to welcome the sorriest stranger, he labors under all the material disadvantages of solitude. He can get no temporary assistance for any work that requires a greater union of strength than that afforded by his own family, or by such help as he can permanently keep. Though he has cattle, he cannot often have fresh meat, for to get a beefsteak he must kill a bullock. He must be his own blacksmith, wagon maker, carpenter, and cobbler, in short, a jack of all trades and master of none. He cannot have his children schooled, for to do so he must himself pay and maintain a teacher. Such things as he cannot produce himself, he must buy in quantities and keep on hand, or else go without, for he cannot be constantly leaving his work and making a long journey to the verge of civilization. And when forced to do so, the getting of a vial of medicine or the replacement of a broken auger may cost him the labor of himself and horses for days. Under such circumstances, though nature is prolific, the man is poor. It is an easy matter for him to get enough to eat, but beyond this, his labor will suffice to satisfy only the simplest wants in the rudest way. Soon there comes another immigrant. Although every quarter section of the boundless plain is as good as every other quarter section, he is not beset by any embarrassment as to where to settle. Though the land is the same, there is one place that is clearly better for him than any other place, and that is where there is already a settler and he may have a neighbor. He settles by the side of the first comer, whose condition is at once greatly improved, and to whom many things are now possible that were before impossible. For two men may help each other to do things that one man could never do. Another immigrant comes and, guided by the same attraction, settles where there are already two. Another and another, until around our first comer there are a score of neighbors. Labor now has an effectiveness which in the solitary state it could not approach. If heavy work is to be done, the settlers have a log rolling and together accomplish in a day what singly would require years. When one kills a bullock, the others take part of it, returning when they kill, and thus have fresh meat. And he talks about they can hire a school teacher, and so on and so forth. And in this section, he ends by saying, by and by, okay, let's see. There's one part. He says, at the wedding, there are others to admire and enjoy. In the house of death, there are watchers. By the open grave stands human sympathy to sustain the mourners. And he talks about by and by comes a circus, talked of for months, and an opening to children whose horizon has been the prairie, all the realms of the imagination, princes and princesses of fairy tale, etc., etc. So I'll skip ahead. Population still continues to increase. And as it increases, so do the economies which its increase permits, and which in effect add to the productiveness of the land. Our first settlers' land being the center of population, the store, the blacksmith's forge, the wheelwright's shop are set up on it or on its margin, where soon arises a village which rapidly grows into a town, the center of exchanges for the people of the whole district. With no greater agricultural productiveness than it had at first, this land now begins to develop a productiveness of a higher kind. To labor expended in raising corn or wheat or potatoes, it will yield no more of those things than at first. But to labor expended in the subdivided branches of production which require proximity to other producers, and especially to labor expended in that final part of production which consists in distribution, it will yield much larger returns. And then finally, population keeps still increasing, giving greater and greater utility to the land and more wealth to its owner. The town has grown into a city, a St. Louis, a Chicago, or a San Francisco, and still it grows. Production is here carried on upon a great scale with the best machinery and the most favorable facilities. The division of labor becomes extremely minute, wonderfully multiplying efficiency. Exchanges are of such volume and rapidity that they are made with the minimum of friction and loss. Here is the heart, the brain of the vast social organism that has grown up from the germ of the first settlement. Here has developed one of the great ganglia of the human world. Hither run all roads, hither set all currents, through all the vast regions round about. Here, if you have anything to sell, is the market. Here, if you have anything to buy, is the largest and choicest stock. Here, intellectual activity is gathered into a focus, and here springs that stimulus which is born of the collision of mind with mind. I'll leave it there, but it's a good passage for you to take a look at. So the point is, this, as George lays out, and I don't think we really can have any possibility of doubting that this is the way civilizations develop. What he's doing is to show the actual effect of the increase of population on the ability of a society to produce wealth. So I want to close by saying, you remember how I started this session by talking about dog-eat-dog versus cooperation, the two worldviews of how we most wisely should live in society. Recently, in George's book, The Science of Political Economy, I happened on an account of the role that cooperation plays in shipbuilding. After marveling over the way that directed cooperation enables a crew to sail a fully rigged clipper ship as if it were a bird in flight, George describes the even more impressive role of unconscious or spontaneous cooperation in the building of such a ship. Consider the timbers, he writes, the planks, the spars, the iron and steel of various kinds and forms, the copper, the brass, the bolts, screws, spikes, chains, the ropes of steel and hemp and cotton, the canvas of various textures, the blocks and winches and windlasses, the pumps, the boats, the sextants, the chronometers. When a shipbuilder receives an order for such a ship as this, he does not send men into the forest, some to cut oak, others to cut pine. He does not direct some to mine iron ore and others copper ore and others lead ore, some to plant hemp and some to plant cotton. Nor does he attempt to direct the manifold operations by which these raw materials are to be transformed and assembled in the place where the ship is to be built. What he does is to avail himself of the resources of a high civilization and to make use for his purpose of the unconscious cooperation by which, without his direction or any general direction, the efforts of many men have brought together the materials and productions needed for the putting together of such a ship. A modern ship, he writes, like a modern railway, is a product of modern civilization. Here's a little graphic of that correlation of, in case you couldn't imagine what that ship would look like, is a product of modern civilization, of that correlation of individual efforts in which what we call civilization essentially consists. A mere master of men, though he might command the services of millions, could not make such a ship unless in a civilization prepared for it. A pharaoh that built pyramids, a Genghis Khan who raised mounds of skulls, could not do it. So that account of shipbuilding has paid dividends for me. I'm more aware than I used to be of the myriad types of labor that are, in effect, exchanged to produce the food we eat, subsistence, buildings like this one, cars on the road, the cell phones we carry, or the wireless networks that animate them, to say nothing of the services rendered in restaurants, hospitals, schools, or the arts. Cooperation is not just the occasional random act of kindness, it is ubiquitous, routine. Nearly all of us have incentive to cut the line, yet instinctively nearly all of us understand the value to each and all of us in taking our turn in traffic. We are not so much about the cutter, we are all about the line. Nearly all of us, that is to say, furthermore, in debunking the wages fund theory and the Malthusian theory, George undercuts the major social theories that are sometimes used as justifications or rationales for dog-eat-dog. It is not the case, as the ruthless or their sycophants claim, that nature justifies and admires only the ruthless. I find it especially heartening these days to consider that our nature is far less dog-eat-dog than the fearmonger would have us believe. We may share combative traits with apes or wolves, but thankfully, we are most fundamentally cooperative. The Malthusian theory, reasonable on its face and with superficial analysis, is shown to be invalid on this further analysis by Henry George. So in 2 weeks, Alan Smith will talk about the following. If neither population growth nor the limitations of a capital fund, erroneously viewed as the sources of wages, are responsible for poverty, and if wealth productivity actually increases as population grows, then what does account for the persistence and the deepening of poverty as society becomes more populous and in fact progresses in wealth-producing power? The answer must lie in the distribution of wealth and not a society's ability to produce it, and the next session is going to deal with this in 2 weeks. So if there are questions, I don't know if we want to take a break. I'm happy to do discussion. You guys have been very patient in listening to me expound at you, but we could do the dialogue now. Since some of you seem to still be awake, maybe most of you, I'm not going to make assumptions, but we'll know if anybody makes a noise. Do you want to keep it rolling or keep going?
It's not been that long where we need a break. But I've got a question, but
Okay.
I don't want to dominate the microphone, so I'm willing to give it up for the first question. Okay. I thought it was an excellent class. I think you did a great job on the book 2. One of the things I think maybe it'd be good for this discussion is to look not only at the wages fund theory, which we covered in the first 2 classes, and now the population theory that's just been debunked. Another theory that George gets into in book 2, maybe not as much as he will, but he gets into that diminishing returns between capital and labor, that once good lands are used, then we have to go to the less fertile, and so there's going to be less returns, which he claims all 3 together form that, 3 stools of this. Well, in the first 2 classes, I called it intellectual gutter talk. Mm-hmm. And I like to use those strong words because I think George would probably condone that kind of thing. So he's laying the foundation with these theories in the early parts of the book, because I know he's going to harp on them near the end of the book.
Well,
so we don't forget those things.
Yeah, I would, that's a good point. I think it's true that the theory of diminishing returns, which is often aimed at agriculture, it overlaps a lot with Malthus's theory. I mean, it's almost as if it's implicit in Malthus's theory, because Malthus is basically saying that nature can produce less subsistence per person as population grows. And that's almost, if you flip it around, that's almost a statement of John Stuart Mill's diminishing returns, that as population grows, nature, he uses the phrase the niggardliness, meaning stinginess of nature. And George, you know, including in the passage, the long passage I read, kind of really rejects that claim, because he says, actually, if you focus, as he does, I think, brilliantly in a number of books, on how wealth is actually produced, including agricultural wealth, what you see is that the presence of population and even the density of population increases our ability and magnifies it, amplifies it dramatically over what we are able to do when population is sparse. And another way I think that George sort of aims himself at the theory of diminishing returns is to say that the focus on agricultural wealth is misplaced. I mean, as crucial as food is, as he also points out, that, you know, the manufacture of other things that allow us both to produce food and to produce other wealth once we're able to get fed, is all part of the picture, and the emphasis on agricultural production is misplaced. But I would say this: it's not misplaced if, in fact, if it were actually true that more people made us less able to produce food. But again, the kinds of things that Malthus and possibly Mill, I'm not sure, looked at to support their claim that that happened don't hold up. The Irish potato famine. Ireland was producing food when there was a famine. You know, the more you look at it, both on the agricultural level, and I mean, we have had surpluses in times when there have been people starving in the U.S. and crops that were, you know, sort of destroyed because of surplus. So the more you look at it, the problem does not seem to be, as Mill and Malthus and others have claimed, our inability to produce wealth, and it's due to population. But it's a hard thing to. It's a very persistent belief, because if you go to the really congested centers of the world, that's where you do find deep poverty. So on the surface, it's easy to associate the one thing with the other. I mean, this under the influence of George, I would say that's a fallacy. There's a logical fallacy called post hoc ergo propter hoc, which in this context would be something along the lines of just because two things happen in connection with each other doesn't mean that the one thing causes the other thing, but it may erroneously be assumed to be so. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we've got another question.
Oh.
We want to have the recording pick up the comments. So.
This is a related question. Well, I agree completely with the notion of George's view over human sustainability versus Malthus. I question the use of GDP as the argument to illustrate that, because as economies mature, less and less of GDP is comprised of sustainability industries, be it agriculture or health or whatever. I mean, I remember in the 90s, our largest growing export as the United States was legal services, which I don't think would factor into a Malthusian argument.
That's a frightening, I'm not questioning, as a lawyer, that's unsettling.
But I just wonder philosophically,
Yes.
if using GDP
Yes.
encompassing the entirety of an economy as it does is the best way to make the argument.
Well, you know, Steve, should I repeat that, or, I mean, would that have come, would we have heard that?
I think, well, you can summarize.
All right, let me summarize. Okay, so your point is that, is to question the validity of using GDP, as I've mentioned it, as a measure of productivity, because increasingly in recent years, a larger and larger component of GDP may have less and less to do with subsistence, and, for example, more and more to do with something like, God forbid, legal services. So my only response to that is I feel so much better for having questioned my own use of GDP earlier to anticipate possibly such an objection. I think that's a good point. You know, what one really wants then is to compare the production of you know, things that are directly or indirectly edible, because that's what Malthus was talking about, and compare that to population growth curves. But all I can say fairly lamely is that in the hour of research I did, I didn't look for it or find it. Maybe those things exist. So it is, as I even suggested, it's questionable how much you can rely on those charts that I put up. But I will say this, that still leaves the other qualitative arguments and debates and critiques of Malthus untouched. I mean, it would be nice to have those statistics, but again, if you look at the ability of various societies, such as Ireland during the potato famine, to produce surplus food for export, essentially as tribute to the absentee landlord, that certainly questions the validity of Malthus's claim. But I think your point is a good one, and just takes my point even further, as should have happened. So thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Thanks a lot. I wasn't sitting here, but I was watching the live stream, and I heard the argument that you made, you know, regarding Malthus's key point, that the more people you have, the more pressure there is on the systems, and sooner or later, if government fails to act, nature is going to take care of it. It's not going to look good. Now, we don't hear of Malthus per se, but there is sometimes we hear lately people who are more or less dealing with so-called environmental issues, bringing up the same argument, saying that nature is almost reaching its limits. So the more people you have, the more pressure on nature. Now, I was wondering, how would you recast the George's argument in order to, you know, present a counterpoint to that line of thinking?
Well, I mean, I've thought of, so I'll repeat just in case some of that dropped out. So the question has to do with how to address, ideally from George's point of view, to the extent we can do that, the claim on the environmental side of things, environmental thinking and policy, that we do seem to be running as a civilization, you know, globally, and in different countries, we seem to be, the fear is that we're in danger of running up against the limits of nature to sustain us. Probably, I would guess you mean not just in the ability to produce food, but well, I mean, water is, I guess, needed for subsistence as well. Clean air and water, other things that we need to survive, and probably even things beyond that that we need for good sort of spiritual health, so that we're not sort of living in a overcrowded and sort of polluted world. I mean, I've thought about this a little in recent times, and I think that, you know, as much as I can guess, I think that George's perspective on this would be, although take this with a grain of salt because it could be mine, sort of George filtered through me naturally, that environmental concerns are are very much intertwined with economic concerns in the sense that when you have a society that is so beset by poverty and unemployment and low wages, it may be difficult for people in the short term, for people to sacrifice certain types of short-term, very bad environmental practices in favor of the long-term sort of stewardship of natural resources. If people are hungry and at risk of starvation, they may be motivated to, say, cut down forests or, harvest crops that, when times are less dire, it has always been the tradition of people to be more mindful of the longer term. So I think to some extent, I guess this is my perspective, but I'll try to relate it to George. I think some bad environmental practices are often a reflection of economic and also of political dynamics that George very much talks about. So if you have a system that is perverted or corrupted by monopoly or by the outsized influence of monopolistic industries on legislatures, you can sort of, I didn't really intend to have a pun, but you can sort of railroad through policies that will benefit particular industries at the expense environmentally of the society at large. So, I think maybe that would be George's take on it, where we have Flint, Michigan, or, various places in the world where obviously the environment is being treated very poorly. I think a lot comes down to, sort of unjust or, unfortunate kind of monopoly of power, which is very much tied up with the economic monopoly. So that's the best I can do on that one.
Thank you.
Okay.
I got two more questions, but, okay.
Go for it.
Being an environmental person, I guess sometimes I call myself an environmentalist, sometimes I call myself an environmental engineer. I am an environmental engineer. But I think it was a very good question because it kind of gets to the point of why we're going through the Progress and Poverty book by book and chapter by chapter, is to find those things that come up that are untruthful, but we stop and say, is that true? And so, Henry George is putting to rest, he's hoping, the idea of the wages theory fund, that wages come from capital and the Malthusian thing, and then the diminishing returns. So we come along with this question about the carrying capacity, because I think that's what Ibrahim was getting at. So I think what Henry George would say in terms of those things that continue to destroy the habitat and ecosystem is that we're not creating the wealth that we could and should. For example, we know that lower carbon energy sources would be better for the planet, so why don't we do it? I'm also a passive house certified designer, and I know that New York City, for example, could reduce its use of energy in buildings by like 90% if it adopted the German standard on how you build houses. But how do you combat the building trades that have a stake in the way buildings are being built? And so that's a whole other thing. But the point was that using intelligence creates higher value, because a building that uses less energy, you got more money for something else. So it's a matter of creating higher wealth with the same energy, I suppose, or labor. So that was the point I wanted to make in that. I thought it was an excellent question. The other question I want to bring up, and it also gets back into the book, but it kind of goes beyond it. And I texted it earlier today, and I'm not sure if everybody had a chance to respond to it. But Henry George makes a very good point. I've never read this guy. His name is Godwin. But his claim is that Malthus responded to Godwin's book on political justice with this. So it was almost as if there's a force in the world that don't want to talk about economic or political justice. So let's trot out Malthus and have this theory to derail it. Just like the point I was trying to make is, okay, Henry George comes out, talks about the unearned increment of land value should go to infrastructure and social purposes. So what is trotted out to diss George? So I see this connection between Godwin and then Malthus did this. Henry George did this. And if you know about Mason Gaffney and Fred Harrison, it was neoclassical economics that would kind of put to rest, so to speak, Henry George. So I thought maybe, would you want to tackle that?
Well,
parallel?
sure, but you may have to help me out because I'm not that versed in what I have learned only recently is called sort of neo-Georgism. As I've said somewhat here before, I was surprised to find out that when I first contacted the George School a couple of years ago, that it was Andy Mazzoni who sort of labeled me as a classical Georgist. I mean, until that point, I'm a newcomer to this. I thought there was just George, and I was a little bit in the position of the person in the Molière play, something or other, Gentilhomme.
I just want to add, there's nothing to apologize.
No, but the bourgeois gentilhomme. I couldn't think of the word bourgeois. Make of that what you will. Where there's a character who is told that what he has been speaking has been prose, and he says, oh my God, for 40 years I've been speaking prose and I never knew it. So apparently I'm a classical Georgist. That is an unnecessary bit of background to answer your question, but to get to the heart of it, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding about sort of neo-Georgism is that it kind of blends some of George's ideas with more conventional or more, scholastic, academic, economic ideas. And in so doing, that my impression, again, from a place of semi-ignorance, okay, so comment on this, is that at a certain point that kind of muddies and really does destroy George's thinking. For example, if you sort of equate capital in landholding or in other areas as well with other forms of wealth, or kind of muddy the distinction that George makes for purposes of clarity between wealth, as he calls it, and land. You really, at a certain point, can be undercutting his central insight, what I see as his central insight. So the more you bring in extrinsic ideas, if it's done in a certain way, it can indeed have the effect of kind of diluting his contribution to economic thought. I mean, what George has to say in a lot of areas, to my knowledge, you don't find anywhere else, unless it's in other people who have sort of been inspired by him. But in conventional thinking, or in the schools and so on, the economic curriculum, you know, except as a sort of sometimes derided footnote, you really don't find those qualitative ideas. So if that's the dynamic you're talking about, I think it does George a disservice, and then to use the name George in neo-Georgism, to that extent may be a disservice. But again, I defer to you, because I'm not that knowledgeable about it. This is secondhand.
Just to add something to that, I don't know of any Georgist besides Andrew Mazzoni calling himself a neo-Georgist.
Okay.
So I don't think it would be, you know, too accurate to Paul Mason that presented as he calls himself as a neo-Georgist. Those people are known as Georgists.
Okay, and the other point I want to make
Okay.
is that I did say the word neoclassical economics.
Mhm.
That was the
Yes, and I did, I restated it incorrectly,
Yeah.
so, yes.
But anyway, your answer answered that anyway. So, because the point was is that just that, I really need to read Godwin's thesis to see what Malthus apparently was trying to refute. But it's very clear when neoclassical economics was created, born, it seems as though it's a very intentional thing to conflate land with capital, to eliminate that distinction. And if you eliminate the distinction between land and capital, Henry George is just some kind of cartoon.
Well, you
Nothing.
kind of return the thinking to where it was before George kind of had his insight. You know, one of his big things, he calls it clearing ground, to sort of clarify the distinction between capital and land, largely because of the wages fund theory, and also to debunk the conventional wisdom, which is population and the limitations of capital really make people the enemy, and blame nature for the existence of poverty. So you might as well do what you can to get your bit, and take the blame away from human institutions, which is where George sees it. Yeah, so somebody else, you did some,
Yeah, we got
No?
some other questions.
no? Did I make that up? I just saw movement and I assumed that was a question.
Well, I think it's
Yeah.
clear that the people who are opposed to our way of thinking, I mean, if you look at the thesis that we just heard about Malthus, it's clear that the people who have power want to convince the rest of them, of us that don't have power, that there's nothing we can do about it. And I
Yeah.
think that's the insight Henry George is saying, well, that's all garbage.
I mean, George really does expend a little bit of outrage at the idea of blaming nature. Sometimes George is very much a devout, sort of religious person. That was his upbringing. And he talks about this as blaming the Creator, blaming God for poverty. But other times he's more of a scientific, sort of naturalist type of a guy. And he may use nature and God sort of interchangeably. But in either way, he's outraged at the idea that, you know, Malthus did his bit to further that it has nothing to do with the way people behave and treat each other, and social and political institutions, economic arrangements. It's inevitable. What's going to happen in society because of nature is that there's going to be poverty. And I think some people, you know, people who are ruthless and kind of dog eat dog don't need to have read, and many people on all sides of that moral spectrum have probably not read Malthus. But Malthus can and sometimes has been used as or his thinking to justify the dog eat dog view. Again, from people who have not read him, there's still this attitude that this is, you know, it's like in West Side Story. Things are tough all over, you know. So you better get yourself a piece of prosperity, because if you don't, the world is winners and losers. And the thing to do is to not be a loser. If you're too nice, if you're too compassionate, you're just a sucker, because the world is inherently dog eat dog. And you know, what I've hoped to do in this talk is to, you know, sort of combat that or contest that, you know, everywhere we look around us, when we're inclined to feel that the world rightly has become, I mean, accurately has become more polarized. That's accurate, it's not right. You know, everywhere you look, especially when you've read a little bit of George recently, you see signs in the fabric of our social being of cooperation everywhere. People exchanging, whether they know it or not, services, you know, sort of seamlessly, voluntarily. The way of the world, really socially, is cooperation. And, you know, I think there are people who take advantage of that, but I think fortunately for us as a species, Hopefully we'll get back to that. The predominant thing is cooperation. Yes?
Well, George is a basis for our economic well-being. There's a couple areas, though, that he never accounted for because of when he was living. And one was the environmental causes we're so caught up into. I mean, you see it in his book where he, is enthusiastic about how coal is produced. Well, most people would agree today, we want to keep coal in the ground. We don't want to deal with coal anymore. The other thing is, like people like Steve here have pointed that out, and George never really accounted for it, with the financialization of economic life in, the large countries of the world like us and the UK, et cetera, where production is really a thing of the past. It's really all about financial services. So it's sort of like really makes Georges have to really do some homework in terms of how to apply these new social problems with,
Well, I have two comments. Very good, interesting comments that you've made. On the subject of coal, I don't think there's anything in George or the spirit of his writing that inclines me to believe that he would want coal to remain as a thing to the expense of the environment. I think, his view of the world is holistic enough. I mean, coal and steam and some electricity is what there were in his day. But there's nothing about his thinking that makes me think that he would resist improving and finding cleaner sources of energy. I mean, he was an anti-monopolist, let's remember. And I think he would be very quick to see in the outsized influence of coal companies, et cetera, on our politics, the kind of corruption that he was talking about. So, I mean, I think he would be all for, smarter environmentalism, even if the particular issue didn't exist in his day. I think the more profound thing which you've mentioned, which I've heard before in other sessions, this idea that the modern world and the way our economy works has to some extent has gotten more complicated and evolved away from the way the economic universe and the world worked in George's day. And I'm, sort of a bit resistant to that, and here's why. I think if you think of the sort of central insights and thinking that George, came up with and expounded, I don't think that there's anything qualitatively that is in any way weakened or vitiated in any important way by the fact that we may have a more service-oriented economy, that our financial markets have evolved and are different than they were in his day. Because today, just as it was in George's day, and bear in mind there was banking in George's day, and he was pretty well aware of how it worked. But just today, just as in George's day, your economy in a lot of ways is based on sort of base industries. When you have people in the more sort of menial food producing, basic service, basic manufacturing producing industries that through industrial depression lose purchasing power, that effect is magnified up through all of the financial markets you want to name. You can have a market crash where for most of my life land values were nothing but increasing, and then in 1990, and then you have 2008, you have the crash of markets. These are the same things that George talked about. The fact that I could probably find a quote that comes to mind where he says, in any of our thinking, anything he's talking about was what must constantly be borne in mind is that the dynamics that determine the workings of the economic world and society in a complex society are no different than they are in a more primitive society. And again, bear in mind that he was writing after, well-established many years of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of things had come in that had not existed before. So even though we have modifications that have continued those trends, they were in existence enough in his day that qualitatively, I think his insights are as powerful today as they ever were. I mean, if you trace through, you know, the layers of how people extract wealth from nature and have to live off of it, the complexity of financial markets, I don't think touches the qualitative insights that George had. So I respectfully disagree with that view. And you notice the use of the word respectfully shows that I have legal training. It's so if you want to be cynical, but it is respectfully. I don't mean to undercut that.
So if there's no other questions, I guess we can bring the session or the class to an end. And I'd like to appreciate Stephen Sklar for putting the third class together. It was a great presentation and a great Q&A.
Thank you for having me.